Hi you guys, this is Nicole from My Carolina Garden. My garden is located in southeastern North Carolina, so I'm at the bottom of the state on the coast in growing zone 8B. And as you can see, with snow still around me, the winter weather that surprised us earlier hasn't gone away just yet. So the big topic that's on a lot of our minds is how is this unusually cold period of time going to affect our southern gardens? So we want to know, are our plants going to be able to make it into the spring and emerge as normal? Are we going to have damage to root systems or leaves? All sorts of things like that. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today because it's so important. We spend so much time and energy making our gardens beautiful, and sometimes Mother Nature can just pop on in and change the plan altogether. So let's take a look at what kind of plants are particularly vulnerable or strong and all of that kind of stuff. I would also like to invite you to subscribe to my channel if you like the kind of content I provide, just to ensure that my content continues to show up in your feed. So of course we know that different plants have different cold tolerances. Part of that is, the growing zone, where they're going to flourish most likely on the varying degrees of temperature that you get, etc. So you can see right here that my creeping moss phlox is still blooming. So even after it was completely snow covered and then the snow began to melt and everything, we have some perfectly beautiful blooms here. And of course, the phlox is an early spring bloomer, so this makes sense. It can really tolerate the cold temperatures. Some plants are going to be like that, some are not, especially when we're talking about some tender perennials, like tropical style plants. For example, my cordyline that I have over here, this is something that I'm experimenting with this year to see if it will come back for me because it's supposed to in the growing zone that I'm in. But it is considered a more tropical style plant. It really doesn't love the winter, freezing temperatures and snow and that sort of thing. We're gonna talk about many more things and leaf damage and some plants that actually have like antifreeze built into their systems, etc. But one of the things that I wanna point out is it's important to note that snow is also like a blanket for our plants and for the ground. So the effects of snow are actually different than the effects of the freezing cold temperatures. So the snow can actually help to regulate the temperature down in the ground and in the soil and keep the root systems protected as compared to that cold air. It could damage plants that have growth above the ground and plants that want to pop out their buds super duper early. So let's look into that. Hydrangeas are an example of a plant that sets early buds. And so they actually set their buds in the previous growing season. So if any of the buds get damaged from the cold now, that could greatly reduce the amount of blooms we get or the performance of this plant in this upcoming growing season. One thing to think about though is the plant is probably still going to stay alive. It just may be the performance of the blooms this particular year. So that would be something we're watching for. The azalea would be another example of a plant that sets their buds early. So it's possible that if I had any early budding up on my azalea bush, because winter was mild all the way up until January and then the bitter cold came in. So it's possible I might see some problems with my azalea this year, but again, the plant should be just fine because the root system is underground, but we may see significantly less blooms this year. The crepe myrtle is an example of, so it's the sudden temperature drop that could affect our plants. If they've been growing in a mild winter and then all of a sudden the temperature drops, they're not fully acclimated, particularly our plants here in the south. That's when we may see results that are a little bit more unexpected. Now the crepe myrtle is a flowering shrub or tree. We may notice that the bark splits on it. Things like that could happen. We're just going to be watching out for signs of any sort of damage on them. Most of our southern gardens just aren't acclimated to this frigid weather, and that's the biggest part of the problem. It's just like us as human beings. If you lived somewhere in a colder climate and moved somewhere down in the south where it's much hotter, it's going to take your body a little while to adjust to that. It's similar to our plants and our trees. These types of trees anyway. Of course, deciduous trees or a plant that is dormant already for winter we're not going to worry about those because they're not in an active growing state. Deciduous trees want to go to sleep for the winter, and that's actually great news for us. Anything that is fully dormant right now is not going to suffer. So keep that in mind too. We're not worried about everything. It's just certain things we're taking a look at. So we've talked about cold tolerance, like some of our tropical style plants or some of our more tender perennials. They may not be able to withstand the cold because of that sensitivity. And now we're also talking about the cold acclimation. How fast did the cold turn on us? Like, how fast did winter just arrive all at once? So in talking about that cold acclimation, some plants have an amazing tolerance for cold hardiness, and that's because they actually produce this natural antifreeze, these sugars and proteins inside of them that actually prevent their cells from freezing. So things like pine trees, spruce, fir, they all produce this natural antifreeze, and that's how they keep their needles, and they're out there and they can stand the winter. Some other plants like daylilies and yarrow and some other perennials actually have this antifreeze built into their root system. So while the tops above the ground may die off, the roots are staying strong underneath. And then some other really cold tolerant plants like the phlox that we just talked about, or pansies, they have a built-in antifreeze system as well, and that gives them the most kind of armor against the cold. If you're familiar with my garden, then you know that I have a lot of tropical plants. Most of them I will overwinter indoors because being in zone 8B is definitely not the same as being in like a Florida zone 10 or something like that. I have bougainvillea, for example, that is just not meant to survive my winters, and I will overwinter that indoors. But tropical hibiscus, which is also technically a warmer zone plant, I have kept this in my ground for about 5 years now, and only the first year I covered the plant over with a frost blanket. Besides that, the only thing I've done in subsequent years was just over mulching the root system, and it's been fine for me. So I'm hoping that this type of tropical hibiscus would be definitely more tender than, say, a hardy hibiscus that can be grown up in zone 5 or something like that. I may see a problem with this guy this year. But largely, even things like ginger, it's the rhizome root system that's going to be protected under the ground, and especially if we've mulched over the roots in preparation for the winter. And that was one of the things, of course, we talked about in the overwintering processes before we actually got into winter. Okay, what are we going to cover over? Caladiums would be an example of that. Keeping the beautiful caladium foliage just by adding extra insulation through that mulch. Let's talk about something called leaf scorch. Now, leaf scorch sounds awful, but it's probably just leaf damage that isn't going to actually terminate the plant. So let's talk about that. Some broad-leafed evergreens, like the camellia, are tough, they are winter hardy, but they are not immune to all of winter's harsh effects. So prolonged exposure to very frigid temperatures or drying winds can actually cause trouble on your leaves because the camellia is giving off moisture through its leaves continually. Well, if it can't get a great water source, if it's drying out at all because maybe the ground is frozen, or like with these winds, it can't keep up, it's not moisturized enough, we may see the kind of scorching on the leaves like I have here on this plant. So it's sad because the camellia is a beautiful specimen, and I definitely don't want to have problems. They're not a cheap specimen either, but I will assess the damage once spring comes and see what actually needs to be clipped off. I'm not going to be doing that right now, especially while we're still battling the cold and the long-lasting snow. The South is used to short cold spells, not prolonged and really deep ones like we've just experienced and we're just starting to come out of. So, of course, having that prolonged cold exposure does increase the risk for damage to our plants, and maybe some root systems can be affected, especially, as we said, for like tropical plants who have like not a deep root system. That is possible, but do we need to worry that we're losing our whole garden this year? No, let us not fear. One of the good things is that this happened in January. Please let it not happen again this winter, because that would be bad. If we go through a freeze and then we thaw and things get mild and then we freeze again, that could really confuse our plants, and then we might have more difficulty after that. But we're not going there. We're just talking about the January freeze. At least in January, like I said, a lot of our plants are in dormancy, so they're not actively producing new leaves and new buds and all that kind of stuff. That is really good. So likely we will have suffered cosmetic damage, things that we're going to have to clip off come springtime, but likely we're not going to be losing all of our plants. You know, though, besides the cosmetic damage, we might see less blooms, we might see slower growth, we might be off to a slower start initially when spring starts. But again, if our plants bounce back, ultimately, still a win. Although it's been fun, I hope this is the last time you see snow in my secret garden, because I want it to be the last time. So moving forward, let's talk about some ways that we can mitigate the damage. How can we be in front of it if we know temperatures are going to get brutally cold again, or we're going to prepare for another Arctic blast or something? What are some of the things we can do? Well, early on, as we said, over mulching, adding additional layers of mulch to insulate the roots, that would be one thing. Protecting your plants that are early budders, a thing, again, like the hydrangea or the azalea, something that you know is producing buds early, cover that baby up. You can use the frost blankets that you can purchase, or burlap, or something like that. I know it's a lot of extra work, but if you want to save your babies, that would be one thing that you could do. You know, this seems funny and almost counterintuitive, but make sure you've watered your plants thoroughly before a freeze is coming, and you feel like, oh my gosh, isn't that going to freeze the roots? But actually, when you're hydrating your plant, it actually helps it to fight off that kind of frost and actually keeps it more protected from that kind of frost or freezing cold damage. So let's talk about some of the factors that actually increase our odds for our plant survival. Come spring, we're going to see a flourishing garden. Do you have healthy plants? Are your plants well established? Newer plants are going to be more susceptible to cold damage than plants that have a strong root system that have already been living on your property for a while. Do you have native and hardy plants? Native plants and hardy plants are going to be more acclimated to your particular growing zone. Again, I'm growing zone 8B. Now, if I'm trying to keep, like I said, things like a tropical hibiscus that's really a zone 10 hardy plant, that one is going to be more susceptible to the cold damage. So it's going to be a wait and see kind of a situation to see what happens with that guy. And then, of course, as we said, we're waiting until spring to do our pruning back, our cutting back. And part of it is because we don't want to cut things off that were not necessary to cut, but also because we don't want to start stimulating new growth in our plants when it's too early, because, you know, it's only January right now. We're surely going to get more of a frost again. Am I right? So we don't want our plant to start wanting to pop out and start all this new growth, and then that is going to get damaged as well. So let's not jump the gun on it. We're going to wait and see, but we're keeping our fingers crossed that everything's going to be just fine. One other thing we want to keep a lookout for is something called frost heave. And that's just simply when the ground freezes and then thaws and then freezes and then thaws. It may actually take some plants and lift them up out of the ground a bit. So just check for that. When your snow all melts away, go looking for plants. Make sure that their root systems haven't popped up out of the ground due to some frost heave. And if they have, simply get them back protected underneath that soil again. So we're just going to end here so you can see the open greenhouse, because I had told you during the storm that the greenhouse was really struggling to stay warm. Of course it was. My house was struggling to stay warm. But now it is gorgeous. It's not all that warm outside, but again, as soon as the sun comes up, the greenhouse warms up beautifully. So you can see the beautiful bougainvillea blooming back there with all the pink flowers. Oh my gosh. So that's one of the items that if I had tried to keep that out in my landscape, that would have been considered a tropical plant. likely that would not have lasted for me. But those in Florida, etc., if it's planted in your ground, hopefully those roots are covered up nicely and you're not going to have a problem with your bougainvillea either. We're keeping our fingers crossed for all wonderful things in the spring. If we start noticing some slow growth or some slow flowers to open or buds to form, we know that's because we just went through something really tough. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this was helpful. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, happy planting.